when I was looking for an African American activist to be on the panel, it took a while to find Tim. And before I called him, I looked at his blog, and the more I read his blog, the more I was in awe of what he had done, what he has done with his life. When he was still in elementary school, he was inspired by the Freedom Riders in 1961. He sought them out. He would sneak out of his mother's church on Sundays to attend meetings of the Atlanta student movement. This biography was written by his daughter because the biography I put together, she said it was inaccurate and it didn't do justice to him. He spent most of his high school years following the members of SNCC around, making coffee for them, getting sandwiches, doing anything he could just to be around them and part of the organization. When he graduated high school, he could have gone, I think, to Yale University at that point because he obviously was such a bright man, young man. But he chose to do something else with his life. In January 1965, while on a trip to New York for the National Science Fair, he met and talked with Malcolm X, which sounds like it was a transformative moment for him. He had heard Malcolm speak several times in Atlanta, and this is where he got the idea that the civil rights movement was really only a small part of an international struggle to rid the world of imperialism and colonialism. In a sense, what Malcolm was saying was the same kind of thing that W.E.B. Du Bois was saying in his classic work, The Souls of Black Folk. In March 1965, Tim went on his first real civil rights demonstration. He marched across that bridge in Selma, Alabama on Bloody Sunday. And as you've all probably seen on TV specials, or maybe you saw it at the time, I'm old enough to remember it, he was tear gassed, beaten, and went over by a horse before getting away. I often wonder about those of you who were beaten. I know that John Lewis was beaten over the head on Freedom Ride. Has this left you with any permanent impairments? I mean, I know that the head is well protected by the skull, but to be beaten and went over by a horse, you know, what did that do to you for the rest of your life? And he attended Morehouse College and Yale University, but dropped out when he was asked to join the Black Panther Party in 1968. This was directly related to the words he remembered from Malcolm X. The Black Panthers were an organization that developed solidarity with most of the liberation movements in Africa and Asia at the time. Tim used this opportunity to visit and work in many countries, Cuba, Angola, and in the war and civil war in Angola, the United States government was on the wrong side. North Vietnam and Israel-Palestine. I assume that in Israel-Palestine, he must have worked with the Black Panthers of Israel.
They were beginning. They were calling themselves something different. They were calling themselves the niggers of Israel.
Yeah,
and it was Angela Davis who went to visit there.
They were smart, and they were
information from us.
Organizing protests. They wanted the Israeli government to do something about poverty. The prime minister at that time was Golda Meir, who was a disaster. She not only didn't do anything about poverty, she once said, "I am a Palestinian." What Palestinian? I am a Palestinian. And I've also read that Sadat was making overtures while she was prime minister to make peace. She didn't respond, so instead we got the 1973 Yom Kippur War afterwards. Peace was made. He dug wells in Guinea and inoculated children against TB in Angola in the middle of the War of Liberation there. So this is at least the second time when he risked his life, and spent time in an Israeli prison under extremely harsh conditions. I hope you will talk about that, because when I read this, on the one hand, I wasn't surprised. On the other hand, I'd like to know, what in God's name did they throw you in jail for? What awful crime did you commit in their eyes? When Tim decided to settle down to a normal life and raise children, he found this was impossible in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, where he was too well known by law enforcement to be just a regular citizen. And he said to me that when, under Freedom of Information Act, former Black Panthers got their FBI files, he was lucky to be alive. I remember one incident in particular in Chicago that was written up where the Chicago police raided the home of Fred Hampton, a Black Panther. I think he was sleeping at the time. They killed him. He moved to Philadelphia in 1973, taking jobs in drug rehabilitation and then with the Philadelphia Board of Education. When he moved to Germantown in 1978, he found his new mission and has mostly devoted his time to voter education and registration. From time to time, if the candidate inspires him, he works in political campaigns, most notably for Herb Acklesberg. I don't think Herb's here. I don't think Herb is here today. And Sherry Cohen, both who ran for city council in 1994. He has registered over 400,000 voters.
4,000 voters in 2014.
Yeah. And he speaks at colleges and universities, and he blogs at Tim Hayes' Tales. Tim?
Okay. First thing I want to say, I don't want to mislead anybody. Okay. As ancient as I look up here, I might be the youngest person on the panel. I look older than you, but I was too young to be involved in Freedom Summer in 1964. What gave me a unique perspective, I think, is that I grew up in the 1950s in Atlanta, Georgia, for the most part. But because both my parents were from rural counties in Georgia, Carroll County for my mother and Clark County for my father, we spent a lot of time driving through rural Georgia and spending weeks at a time with my grandparents there. Mm-hmm. So I got to see what the South was like in the 1950s when I grew up in the city and in rural areas. I can distinctly remember being 4 years old, and the man who was married to my grandmother's sister, Aunt Bella, Uncle Johnny, walking me into Albany, Georgia, and saying, "You can't read, but you have to know the difference between a C and a W, so you know how to stay alive." And my father and him had a huge argument after that. And even though Atlanta was the biggest city in the South and just as segregated as the South, it was different because Atlanta was huge enough where the neighborhood we lived in Atlanta, you could spend weeks and weeks without seeing a white person at all. Because I lived in the second largest housing project in the world, Carver Homes. Now, the only white people I knew as a child growing up in Carver Homes were, and I mean this because at the time it was not meant as a smear or anything, but just like every little southern town had a Jew store. Okay? And that was what they called it, the Jew store. Okay? Every neighborhood in an urban southern city had a Jew store. Okay? And so in Atlanta, the smaller Jew stores were only started after World War II. So unlike the large stores in downtown Atlanta, which were started after the Civil War, which was Richmond's original, we had these little stores, and everybody had an accent and had numbers on their arm. The Geisels, who were from Germany originally and went to Poland to escape the Nazis, and they were survivors of Treblinka. Okay, I got my first job working with them. And that's because I would come into the Jew store and buy my 10-cent kite and read the newspapers. And no 10-year-old kid would read the newspaper. So he asked me if I wanted a job. I said, "We'll give you $3 every Friday if you come in and sweep the floors and stuff." And then one day, in a little apartment in the back, he said, come here. I want you to see this." And these people were getting beaten up in a bus station in Alabama. And then after that, they showed film of a bus burning in Tennessee. And they mentioned some names of some people that I just happened to know. One was a guy named Lonnie King, who I happened to know. And he was the head of the Atlanta student movement. And we sat down after that, and he explained to me leaving Germany. I'm 10 years old. Leaving Germany. I was nine. Leaving Germany, going to Poland, thinking that his father had told him, this never happened to us because we're German citizens. It can never happen to us. Okay. I'm hearing this at 9 years old. And he said, well, you know, this is what it reminded me of when I came to America. Okay. He came to America in 1948. Okay. In the middle of Jim Crow. And at first he was in, I think it was Perry, Georgia, but then he moved to Atlanta. Because they lived in a housing project also. There were a lot of housing projects that had refugees from Nazi Germany, Holocaust and all. But I'm saying this because I can't say what character in that book I related to because I wasn't there. There were people older than me. But what that did for me is that those people in the Freedom Riders became, I went into this from my heroes being Flash Gordon and David Crockett. I mean this seriously. My hero suddenly became somebody entirely different. Okay? So I found out when a lot of students were having their meetings, okay? And it was 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock every Sunday. And my mother took us to the Methodist church religiously, no pun intended. I mean, we had to be there all the time. And I developed the ability to sneak out of church on a Monday, Friday and go into the meetings. And I'm 10 years old, okay? And I just had to be around these guys. They became my heroes. I kept showing up. So finally started giving me jobs to do, all right? And this went on for years. The Atlanta student movement hooked up with other black students after the sit-ins in North and South Carolina. And that was sort of the core of what became SNCC. I consider myself a SNCC member. You know, all I did was make coffee, get sandwiches. They gonna call me Tim the Project's kid. But they were my heroes. A lot of people become well-known later. Stokely Carmichael, who was originally the youngest of the Freedom Riders. He said, before church. Okay, he was John Lewis was a serial rider. Diane Nash, who everybody had a crush on. He was a Freedom Rider who became, joined SNCC later on, okay? And I went to dinner with her parents one time. And they were trying to tell her, you know, you're going to get us killed. Now, by then I'm 12.
Diane Nash was a white girl.
No, Diane Nash was what we call a high yellow girl. She was a black woman who was light complexion and had hazel eyes. Like a lot of people in, well, you have to know the history of the South.
Who was the white girl who told the federal marshal, you know, I'm fine, go away, and he was telling her to get in this car, and then he got beaten and she got beaten?
I know a situation like that where they both got shot and killed. But you know, I was a kid. I don't know every situation that happened. Okay. But what I'm getting to is that I look forward to going to my first demonstration. This is after my father said, "Okay, now we know that the situation we live in has to change, Jim Crow. But you don't have to be the one to do it. Let somebody else's kid do it. If I would find out, I had a large family. There were 5 of us kids. I had 2 sisters older than me, and then I was a middle child. We had 2 kids younger than me. Let somebody else's kid do it. If any one of you get involved in it, I'm going to kill you. Okay. And my father was 6'2", 250 pounds. He had been an army sergeant for 20 years before World War II. I mean, this guy scared everybody in the neighborhood. Okay. Me too. He made it. So I did it anyway. During Freedom Summer in '64, what I was doing was, and this is a good story that a lot of people relate to, I was packing care packages, for instance, to send to students that were down there. And I learned that there's a difference between packing the kosher pots. Pots that were not kosher. You can't mix the two, okay? And send them down. Yes, this was one of my jobs. In addition to getting sandwiches and making sure this car was here and this car was there and stuff like that. Okay, I was too young to do that. But in 1965, an organizer named Hosea Williams picked me up in the back of my mother's church on March 5th, 1965, and we drove down to Shalom. That was the Bloody Sunday. Now, the summer march you're talking about are the ones that came after this.
That's right.
The first summer march was organized by the local people in Selma and SNCC members who went against Martin Luther King because he didn't want to do that because they had other things going on. Also, they had money coming in and they didn't want donations to start going other places. We didn't want donations to go there. And I was 15. Most of the guys in SNCC were 19 to 24. And most of the guys in SLT were 30 to 38. Big difference in those days. That's a big difference in age. And we were young whippersnappers, and we were excuse the expression, we were fucking with the boat. Okay, they did not like that. And they decided, John Lewis, who, despite his passive demeanor, was very defiant against King. Stoker Carmichael back then was sort of like, and him and Willie Rich were like Abbott and Costello. They weren't really serious on these things. And they used to, I'm serious. Stoker Carmichael's family today is against our man was the funny man back in those days. He had nothing to do with this. But John Lewis said, we're going to do this anyway. And Hosea Williams, who was the organizer for SCLC, went against King too, and he went down there. And so also did Andrew Young, who was one of the key strategists. He went down there, okay? And I went down there with about 20 high school kids from Atlanta. And you know the story, just like in that movie, which was kind of screwed up. It's kind of how we crossed that bridge, and they said, you're not going anywhere, stop, cease and desist, turn around and go back home. And we didn't say anything, we stood there, and the people on the side of the bridge laughed at us and said, look at these niggas getting beat up, and it worked. About half of them were white. About half of them were white. The horses came, the tear gas came, the clubs came. Even now, it's 50 years ago. A haze. I remember about 20 people falling down at the same time in front of me. I fell down. A lady next to me got hit with a club and stuff, with bloodshot out of her head. The horse came and it ran over this ankle right here. And then before I could get up, it got hit me with something that was metal or wood or something like that. Me and a bunch of kids got up and we ran. And we ran. Until we got back to the church where the thing was happening, the happened from. After I got over the field, which took about 2 weeks, that was what I was going to do. Okay? It took, Mr. Geisel, who was the Jewish guy in the store, and showing me that. And then all that stuff for me to see that we had to be the last generation to go through that. I didn't want to have children and have to go through that too. Okay? So now, just to end this thing, because I'm going to give you those questions, but I'm trying to make it make sense for me because I was too young to be in Summer 64. When I got big enough, old enough to be in SNCC was changing. Okay? After 65 is when SNCC said that the white people in SNCC had their own struggles, you got to go back to their own community and organize. And also, there was a lot of things that I was a fly on the wall as a kid. And there were a lot of arguments among mainly white men and black men and women. And we call it missionaries over there. When you go down south because you're coming down to help these poor Negroes because they don't know how to help themselves. And the fact that you have to take instructions, take orders from an African-American man or woman is unacceptable. No matter how liberal or progressive you think you are, even though you can't admit it to yourself, it's very difficult, for a lot of people to accept that. And they don't say it out loud. It comes out in behavior. It comes out in tone of voice. It comes out in the things you actually do. And that became a problem in 65 and 64. But 65 became to the head. And that's when I became a real member of SNCC within 64 to 66. Also, among the black people in SNCC, they were changing too. They were becoming Marxist, Then others were becoming what we call cultural nationalists. And that's when you change your name to Rebop to Hebop or something that sounds great. And you wear a and organizing in the community, you walk around saying black is good, white is bad, and unless you say black is good, white is bad, you ain't about nothing. And you don't organize in the community, you don't register the people to vote, you become a cultural nationalist. It becomes more important to name everything after some African guy, or say, we go say African history, blah, blah, blah. When you can't name 10 countries in Africa. And then you become, they were Marxists. And me and a group of people who were my age in SNCC and older than SNCC went to Marxism. And I became a member of the Black Panther Party. I came back to Atlanta after being in the Black Panther Party in Chicago and New York. And these guys who were my older heroes in SNCC, a lot of them didn't recognize me because I'd grown a lot in fact. And I organized the Atlanta chapter of the Black Panther Party and brought some old SNCC people with me. I became public enemy number one in Atlanta, Georgia. That's how I got this scar right here. The police got them cracked my skull one time for just daring to sell the Black Panther paper on the street. There was other work to do in the Black Panther Party, and this is what you want to find out, okay?
Are any of your present health problems related to the beatings that you experienced?
My ankle works fine, the horse run ankle. You can ask my wife sometime, maybe that he might still crack me affected. I have problems today, but they most have to do with coronary, pulmonary things that are related to childhood birth defects or something like that. But what I want to get to is that it was those guys in SNCC who went Marxist, which meant to study liberation movements and stuff, that caused me to go to Guinea, where we were digging wells to defeat Guinea worm disease. It's a disease caused by drinking water that's contaminated with a parasite, and in 4 to 5 years, it can grow into a 4-foot-long worm in your body, and children get that, and when it comes out, it's very painful and something you got to infect. And the cure was something clean water, okay? And I was only 19 years old when I went there. And I was about to come back to the United States. And we had found out that there was a group in Israel that were Jews who were from Yemen, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, and they were not satisfied with the way we were treated there. And that's what they were calling themselves the niggas of Israel. Okay? And they heard about the Black Panther Party. And they wanted somebody to come there and teach them how to organize their community. I was afraid to go back to the United States because I didn't have a passport. And we had, in the Panthers, we had ways of coming in the country, leaving the country illegally. And I figured that a guy who came from Carver Homes would never ever get outside the United States again in his life. Because most guys ever go with those guys, going 50 miles before they were born. So I went there, and first we organized carpools for people driving back and forth to work and stuff like that. And we organized the same thing we did with the Black Panther Party in our neighborhoods. Babysitting co-ops so a woman could get out and work and stuff. They only have to stay home with their kids one day a week, but she had to watch 4 kids with a babysitter. We did it in the Black Panther Party too. It's just not the sexy stuff you hear about. You hear about the guns and stuff. We did a lot of different things.
So why were you arrested?
Well, they decided that to connect with other, what's that word? Mizrahi? Yeah, Mizrahi Jews. They started connecting with others in Haifa and in Tel Aviv and in other neighborhoods in Jerusalem, and they were going to converge on Jerusalem and have a huge march. Okay, there were 3,000 people there. You can look it up. It's called the Night of the Panthers. The Israeli police cracked down on them big time. They arrested about 1,000 people. I did not go on the march because they didn't want any Americans there, but they found us anyway and arrested all 4 of the Black Panthers that were there. And I was one of those people.
Well, what do they accuse you of?
Well, they spent what felt like 2 weeks, I later found out it was about 10 days, asking me, did the Syrians send you here? Okay. Did the Syrians send you here? Did the Egyptians send you here? To make, they thought we were being sent there to make Israel look bad, to point out racism in Israel. And that had to do with it. I didn't know any Syrians. I got to know a lot later on. Okay. I had no particular separatist toward the Palestinian cause. I didn't know the Palestinians at the time. I got to know many of them later on. But that's what was happening there. It was a group on a kibbutz who happened to have roots in Georgia that found me and got me out and ripped me back to health and got me back to America on a fake passport.
When you say the conditions in prison were harsh, can you describe them?
I don't know if you want to hear that stuff. I was beaten up a lot, and they did some other things that they got scars from. It's not that kind of talking about that much. It was very hard. I was beaten up a lot. Who sent you here? The Syrians sent you here. That was nothing compared to what was going on in that cell. That was nothing.
Were there white Ashkenazim in that march, and were they arrested too and treated better than you were because you
One thing I found out at that time is that skin tone don't mean a whole lot. You can be Algerian and be Jewish, and be as dark as me and be as light as you, and be siblings. Okay, that doesn't mean a whole lot. All right. But I was shocked that there were people in Israel who looked like me. Their hair was straight, but they looked like me. I was shocked at that. I was 19 years old.
That's
Hello.
So what year was this?
That was 1971.
wow.
Yeah.
It's a year after we went.
Wow.
All of that to say that, like I said, the civil rights movement was a lot bigger than we thought it was.
The racism in that country is worse now.
Yeah. Well, that's what I know. Well, since that time, I have many Arab friends. I have many people who still live on Cabooses. The kibbutz that saved me doesn't exist anymore. It's a corporate Israeli farm now.
Right.
The Jaffa industry owns it.
Wow.
Yeah. But the civil rights movement was an awakening, which is what Malcolm X said it should be. It should be an awakening to world conditions of imperialism and colonialism.
Yeah.
And that's what it was for me. But to this day, the greatest people I've met in my life were the people that I saw at 10 years old on that bus, burning and coming off and throwing up and stuff. Okay? And some of them are still alive today, some of them are not still alive today. But they were my heroes then, they were heroes today.
That kind of. I can sort of move to interject something. I teach at Community College in Philadelphia, and my students tomorrow night are going to be writing an exam based on their reading of James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Mm-hmm. And there's a moment, actually, where he describes the young people in those circumstances as the only true aristocrats in this country. Mm-hmm. Which really strikes me. I mean, just the whole kind of sense of maturity and dignity in the face of terrible suffering. And that's, I mean, in some ways, I'm left speechless by everything I've heard here tonight. But I just wanted to say that.
Hey.
I wanted to say thank you. Thank you for being my generation's veterans, fighting the good fight. I have myself been protesting and been accosted and beat by cops. I have myself ended up in hospitals because of the attacks that I've received from cops. I've myself had an opportunity to unfortunately experience the Ku Klux Klan firsthand when I went to college in Oregon. And every single situation where I was speaking for justice and moved to tears and and not afraid of death. It was on the backs of the work that you guys did. And I never really thought, I do thank our veterans for their service, and now the people that I know of that work in the civil rights movement, that are still working in that movement, I will look at them and thank them in a completely different way. So thank you.
please.
Well, I just wanted to say that there is a website called the Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement. Do people know about it? Maybe you all know about it, but if you want to look at what individuals did, and it's very varied, both in terms of who was there and where they were. It wasn't all 64, when the movement really went on through 68, that's when I was there. But anyway, it's a wonderful website, and you should know about it. If you just Google Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement, you'll find it.
I found a ton of stuff there.
Please.
I live in Delaware. I don't know if anybody in this room lives in Delaware. Beside my husband. As you well know, Delaware is a southern state, basically, overall, in the disguise of a northern state. Newcastle County is on the Mason-Dixon line, but Kent and Sussex County is southern. So the majority of the state is a southern state. Honestly, when I was growing up and even now, Delaware has a lot of issues, and we've seen very few over the years, in the 50s and 60s, of people coming to that state. The reason is that the state is controlled by industry.
Is what?
It's controlled by industry.
Corporations, yeah.
Corporations, DuPont, Hercules, all of those. So what happens is, if we have not had people like yourself the whole time I grew up, I'm 70, I grew up 10th and French, 19 years across from the police station. Okay? And you had the Hotel DuPont on the east side of Market Street, and then you had the west side, which most of the Caucasian community moved out, moved to the west side, moved to the suburbs, and it became a majority African-American community, and the east side was the east side. If you lived on the east side, and there were people who had money, teachers that lived on the west side. Where I grew up in a home, and just very quickly, I grew up in a home that was a mansion that was turned into apartments. My aunt and uncle, who were African Americans, came to Wilmington in the 40s. He lived on a farm in Glasgow next to a guy. His family helped this guy raise and train horses. So they had their own farm, okay? So he came to Wilmington to work and married my aunt. And she started to bring a lot of family members from Indiana to here. My hometown is I was born in Indiana. We lived in a roach-infested, rat-infested, mouse-infected, everything in that apartment house. Across the street, just across the street, no wider than this room, there was the elite. A doctor, a couple other people, that's the way it was. In the same block, there was another people that were elite. So we had in Delaware, a lot of people don't know, we didn't have you people. A lot of people come to protest because the fact is they were controlled by industry. They had to work. There were domestic workers. There were other workers. If you were out there on the protest line, you lost everything. In Delaware, and especially Wilmington, it was totally different animal than down south, than in Philly, than in Maryland. Delaware was different, and it still is. It is still very, very different. It's a very, very cultural, diverse. We're starting to get there. We have so many Jim Crow walls, and we still have hanging on the books.
Wow.
And we have more African American men in jail than almost any state, believe it or not. And we have actually executed more people for our little small state than most states that are bigger, even as big as Texas. This is Delaware. So if you know, I have not experienced what you all have experienced because you couldn't go out there because it would definitely affect your family. That meant that your family would not get a job. And there was no such thing as public assistance. So you learned real quick where you could go and where you could not go. Now my auntie, she worked for very wealthy people. So I got a chance to go to the hotel department and eat in the green room and all of this because of the fact she was keeping their children. So when they went, and she went, I went because I was, an only child with them. But when I saw a lot of and experienced a lot of what I had and experienced and what a lot of my peers had, totally different. Totally different. We had the west side, you didn't go to certain points on the west side. You didn't go there. You couldn't go, you came to the east side, you stayed where you were. And you had your Jewish stores, your Polish stores. Those stores were owned by most Caucasians. There were a few stores that were owned by African Americans, but few, because there was no money for them for startup. So Wilmington and Delaware is still basically, in most areas, a very prejudiced state. And we didn't have people that came to protest. We didn't have the marches. If you look in the books, there were hardly any marches or anything like that happening in Delaware. And to be among you all, I understand, we read about it, but we were limited, and especially with my family, a lot of us could not take that chance of being on the firing line because it would affect our families.
I think I have to, one more question.
I want to address what the gentleman stated earlier in reference to the PTS, post-traumatic stress. That exists. And even, I think you could address this as well. My father was a Black Panther, and he was arrested here in Philadelphia 43 years ago. I was 9 years of age. And the trauma that we experienced, our family being interrogated, and some of a couple of my aunts actually mentally lost their minds. The children were never taught, myself, I was 9 years of age then, what really, I never knew what a Black Panther was, although my father was a major figure in it. So I can see to this day the post-traumatic stress issue. And I think outside of the Panthers, it also goes back to slavery. I think it went generation to generation. Imagine a woman pregnant with a child and she's experienced this type of abuse and it's passed on. I really think a baby can experience that. So I'm glad you addressed that. I wanted to say something to you because I'm living that dream of what was done in the 60s and still hoping that it happens today. And it looks like some stuff is happening with the Black Lives Matter because
they hope to finish unfinished work.
Yeah.
Right. So I have been living that well before the Black Lives Matter, hoping there is a rise up against injustice. And I'm seeing people your age who were I didn't really get your age, but
And I'm not telling.
I know, you didn't tell. But I'm assuming what I've seen because I lived this thing as a kid and I said I wanted to join right in. Although my family tried to keep us away from it, I wanted to join right in. But I'm working with a lot of folks who are around about your age who still want to do this Panther thing. They were Panthers, but they're very ineffective. And I'm looking at some of them are suffering with PTS. Some of them are just totally burnt out and don't want to give up the fight. And so I want to ask you, where are you today in reference to
burn out? Do you still have to fight?
What you would call post-traumatic stress syndrome, I would honestly say that I did suffer from something like that from about 1971 until about 1978, 79. I had to make a conscious decision to force myself to live a normal life. I met this wonderful woman over here, and we had these kids, and we did just ordinary domestic life and stuff like that. And it wasn't until I felt really comfortable in that, we bought a house, and I moved from Westfield to Germantown, and I said, hey, wait a minute, okay? You don't vote, you don't vote, you don't vote, you don't vote. And I got back on the horse.
And it's still
okay, but there's still things.
Yeah.
Okay, like I still freeze up when I see a police light because I got my head cracked. Okay. I still, when I get that, well, I call it the, how the hell would you know? Look that you get from a lot of white people when you say, well, so and so is this and so is that, and they give you a look like, yeah, how the hell do you know? It's an expression you get from pouring white people's coffee and mopping their floors and stuff like that, and you get to learn a lot more about them than they know about you. That's part of growing up in a servant culture like I did. Okay? And I'm very sensitive to that today. Okay, well, I don't know, but yeah, yes. The answer to your question is yes. Post-traumatic stress syndrome exists in a lot of different forms. In the more acute form, I suffered from it for about 8 years. Today, it's a psychological thing. But I'm very sensitive to condescending white men. I'm very sensitive, okay? But I haven't hit one yet.
It's time to wrap up. I would hope to see African American Jewish Alliance renewed, but there are all kinds of obstacles now. Many of the older Jewish organizations have been circling the wagons in regard to Israel and defending something which is indefensible, immoral, and that's the occupation. A lot of younger Jews are turned off on this and maybe have just abandoned the organized Jewish community. That's anecdotal on my part. I taught in a Jewish day school for 38 years, went there in '64, retired in 2005. The early years, a racist comment made by a kid in class was a no-no. You just didn't, you may have felt it, but you just didn't do it. And the kid who did it was frowned on. Now, I don't know what's, anecdotally, I hear there's racism there. And, you know what, so is there a possibility of a Black Jewish Alliance? I think so. There are younger people who are still idealistic, and there are a few old Jews like me who remember what it was like before there was an Israel and remember the idealism. Became a Zionist then, but it's pretty damned hard to call myself a Zionist these days. So that's a subject for another day, but I really would like to see that alliance renewed. The group that met here to deal with Michelle Alexander's book on mass incarceration was a beginning. And, where do we go from there? I'm not big on. I'm not an organizer. Just one story though that really bothers me. One observation. I saw this even on MSNBC. What was happening in Baltimore a few weeks ago. Even a liberal commentator like Chris Matthews called it a riot. And I said to myself, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I see teenagers throwing rocks at armed policemen. That's not a riot. I'm a historian. That's a rebellion. That's what we called it when it happened in Israel in 1987. Why are you calling this a riot? It's a rebellion. Our perceptions are still skewed, even among well-meaning people, by the racism that's just It's been part of American society from the beginning. So we would like to light Hanukkah candles. Maybe before we finish, the head of the library committee would you like to say something?
Excuse me for 1 second. I just need one word. I'll take the privilege of the show. I'm actually running a temperature. I'm sick, and I got a 4-hour drive, so it's really been a gratifying evening. Well done.
Thank you.
I got to go. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to quote Julian Bond because he's your hero.
One of them.
One of them. He's one of mine too.
We didn't get to be good friends at the end of his life, Tori.
Yeah.
He was too old. He was much older than us back in those days.
Yeah, absolutely. He said that we can't rest on the past. We have to renew our credentials every day. And I put that back to all of us that, we're talking about history and we're talking about today.
Yeah. It's a good note.
So Lily, did you want to say something, Lily?
Well, just to thank you to Harold for organizing this meeting. Thank you to all the speakers who participated.
Yeah.
So we're going to end this evening with dedication. We brought the candles in here so that we don't lose the energy of this room. And I think there are some matches there that we have.
Harold, are you going to light?
Yeah, we're going to light. I'm going to handle
Now
this
that we like
right now. So hold on, I got a plan. Okay, it was deputized. Yeah, I was asked to create a plan, and here's our plan. So we're not going to have one person light this evening. I'm going to invite our panelists. Each of you here to light a candle, and Natalie and Lillian. And tonight's the culmination of Hanukkah. Tonight the light burns brightest, and we are here to be with each other in this context. And so, as each of you come up and light one of these candles, the invitation as well is to offer a word. If there's a word, what you want that candle dedicated to, a value, something that comes out of the work that we've done. Because if we just have one person lighting the lights, then we can kind of get used to that person doing it all. And just like the miracle of these candles is great, and I thank you, Rabbi Tzura, because we arrived here tonight to discover that we didn't have candles. So tonight is a miracle that happened here. We had no oil whatsoever. And Rivka and Rabbi Simcha were going to save the day, and then they mentioned that they had a struggle to Rabbi Tzura, who said, I have some in my trunk. And so it's when we actually share the challenge we have, as opposed to how am I going to fix this all, that we find there are angels, along the way there. So Ellen, if we could start with you, and we'll just move down here, and then whoever wants to complete the task, and if you can begin by lighting on the left side there.
For justice.
For justice. Simone.
For memory and sharing memories.
Harold?
For an end to racism.
In the name of solidarity.
Netzaker, perseverance. And Arthur, could you
or Phyllis, one of the two of you. Natalie?
For hope.
For hope.
Hope.
And Lillian, could you complete the task? It wasn't yours to start it or to do it all, but neither should you desist from it.
For tzedek, tzedek tirdov, which is justice, justice you shall pursue, and it's right above the arc there. You'll see when the lights come on.
Tzedek, tzedek tirdov, justice, justice you should pursue. Unlike Shabbat candles, which we light and move on, the Hanukkah candles, the mitzvah, the imperative is to take the light in, to stay with this light. And I'm not suggesting we have to stay in this room for that whole time, but that could be a great meditational end to this evening. But even in these moments for us to reflect on these lights, in your light we see light, and blessing and gratitude for all of you who have shared your light in the darkness. This is the darkest time of the year, and from here the light builds again. And it does it when we blaze together, not when our light is diffused and separated from each other. For our blessings for bringing enlightenment into the world, our blessing to say that great action took place at one time for the sake of freedom and liberty, and so it happens here today as well. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu le'olam asher yishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu le'alinei
We take the soul
others' lights go out and still be free. So we light one candle in the dark for the miracles of hope. Light one candle in the dark for the stories yet untold. Light one candle in the dark for the hope that will not die. For freedom's never-ending spark. Light one candle in the dark. Oh, yes, true, I need the calm of Sameach, everybody. Thank you all for putting this program together. Libations and sustenance lay outside. Let's have a hand for all of that.